I think one of the things that I'm most excited about is that I'm learning about bottom-up approaches to solving or finding solutions to these huge, big global problems like climate change. And I find that really a wonderful process to be a part of, because climate change can be super overwhelming. Ocean pollution is just devastating, and it can those problems can stifle movement or overwhelm you as a young person, but to be able to work with communities and actually see change happening relatively quickly, even though it's such a small scale, it's inspiring, and it encourages me to continue on with this work and to see value in the research process.
Climate change isn't just something we're going to be facing in the future. It's something that we're living with right now. So it's critical for Canada to invest in climate action in a way that also meaningfully advances reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So I see graduate studies as one way that we can understand and shed light on how we can tackle some of these challenges, such as wildfire. That means working in partnerships with First Nations who are impacted by these fires, but also who have incredible depth of experience and expertise as to how to manage and live with fire in their territories.
My research is focused at understanding the adaptive capacity of coastal ecosystems to climate change. And by adaptive capacity, I essentially mean how are things responding to climate change in the ocean. I'm focusing specifically on looking at ocean warming and ocean acidification and how those impact marine invertebrates, because there's certain animals that are super vulnerable to acidification and to warming waters. So that's a portion of my research. But another part of my research focuses heavily on understanding how people connect to the ocean and how they want to protect their different values that they associate with water. So those might be economic, ecological, cultural, or social. Everybody connects to the water in different ways. So my research is focusing on documenting that and sharing that information with decision makers so that they can incorporate and include community perspectives in their planning and decision-making processes. My research takes place in a deep water glacial fjord called Howe Sound. And the Squamish Nation place name for Howe Sound is Atketsum. It's one of 3 place names they have for the region. And it means paddling from Squamish out the fjord into the Salish Sea. The sound was used traditionally and still is used as a transportation route for the nation, and now for settler folks like myself. Howe Sound in the 20th century was seriously degraded by industrial activities like forestry. There was a copper mine at Britannia and different pulp and paper mills and chemical plants. So the water was just dead and it stank, and people just thought of it as a degraded area. But over the past few decades, some of that industry has changed its behavior and some of it has shut down. And we've seen a kind of a recovery and a revival of a lot of the marine life in this area, which is super exciting. So the community is engaged, and now they're seeing whales and forage fish like herring, and they're super pumped about it. But we're getting these new sets of pressures in the area. Howe Sound is directly adjacent to Vancouver, which is British Columbia's most populous city. And we're seeing kind of like a spillover effect where a bunch of people are now moving into Howe Sound to live or going there to visit and recreate. And that's bringing a suite of development pressures, pollution, over-visitation. And then we also have climate change, which is creating its new set of pressures with increased storms, changes in precipitation, ocean warming and acidification, all sorts of things. So the pressures have shifted a little bit, and governments and communities in this area are trying to figure out how we respond to those pressures, because you can't just say we can't have anybody coming here. We want people to come and connect to the nature because that's such a fulfilling thing to do, but we have to learn how to do it in a sustainable way. So my research is trying to help government and educators and decision makers in the area learn how they can respond to these pressures without degrading the environmental health and the ocean health.
Graduate studies, for me, it's not about me. It's about the impact we can make in collaboration with communities. So it's not about being locked away in an office or an ivory tower at UBC in Vancouver and behaving like I, as a researcher, know best. It's actually about learning from the people who live in these landscapes. So over this past summer, I spent 4 months with my field crew in a small town called Clinton in interior BC, working to monitor forest recovery after one of the record-breaking wildfires of 2017. Working in partnership with Bonaparte First Nation was critical to this project. So we had their field technicians out with us, we learnt from them, and they learnt from us. So it was quite surreal actually being out in these forests, these blackened forests that had burnt 4 years ago, and seeing how they were coming back, while at the same time we were surrounded by smoke from the wildfires that were burning right now. It's important that research has impact beyond academia. So for me, that means it's important that both the process and the outcomes of my research have meaningful impact for the communities that we're working with. So this can only happen when you're actively engaged with communities, when you commit time to building relationships, and then you can ask them things like, what's important for you? How can research contribute to advancing some of your goals? Or what can it bring to your community?
My work is conducted in partnership with the Squamish Nation, and I feel super grateful to get to learn with them, or to get to learn from them about this area that sits within the heart of their territory. And we are working together with other communities in the Sound to document community knowledge using maps. And it's a participatory process, which means that the community has been involved from the beginning of the project in designing it, in informing the approach that we're going to take, and in sharing that knowledge. And so participatory mapping involves sitting down with people and they actually map out places that are important to them. So they're drawing on these maps rather than me as a researcher interpreting what they're saying and drawing on my own maps. So it's kind of giving the voice to the people whose knowledge is actually creating these maps and these outcomes. Maps are particularly important when we're dealing with the ocean, because the ocean is out of sight, out of mind for a lot of people, and maps can be a fantastic way of lifting up that surface and revealing what's happening below the water, where the sea creatures are, where the humans are fishing, where these things overlap in space. The other thing with maps is that they have a colonial history, right? They directly were used in the exploration and in the settlement and colonization of Canada. And so since our work is being conducted with the Squamish Nation in partnership with them, we're trying to embrace and bring in decolonization into our work so that we can make sure that this mapping process is not continuing to create harm for this community, and that we're trying to sort of heal and work towards that better way of creating these products. One of the things that's really important for us to do is bring in their culture and the nation's language as much as we can. So the place names, rather than using all of these settler place names that were for explorers who had never even visited this body of water, we're trying to bring forward the Squamish Nation's place names and language as much as we can. The Squamish Nation is involved in doing the research. I work with youth from the nation who are actually asking the questions during the interviews rather than me. As a researcher, I'm trying to make sure that I'm kind of taking a back seat, facilitating the community's research process more than anything else.
So with my community partners at the Secwepemcoola Restoration and Stewardship Society, we're about to release a major report that's based on about a year of interviews I did with First Nation staff and leaders, as well as senior staff from the provincial government and BC Wildfire Service. And this report documents both First Nation and provincial government experiences from the 2017 wildfires, as well as identifying lessons learned from the joint process of wildfire recovery. So my goal is to identify lessons learned from these past wildfire seasons. So this includes recommendations for how communities can better prepare for fire, how they can better work with government in responding to fires to make that response more effective, and most importantly, how First Nations can be at the decision-making table, making those decisions about land-based recovery. So as we reflect on some of the challenges from this past wildfire season in 2021, what's really important is making sure that local and Indigenous knowledge is taken seriously and taken into account during response.
Well, my research pertains to working with trees, specifically cellulose, which is one of the structural components of trees. And we take that and break it up into very small subunits and then rebuild those subunits to have very specific properties that we're interested for various industrial applications. Forestry industry is one of the largest industries in Canada. Obviously, you can pretty much look anywhere in Canada and you'll see trees. And so, of course, those are traditionally used for the development of wood and paper products, lumber, and various other construction materials. And so obviously that's a very important industry, but as we start to shift our interests, especially into more ecologically focused materials development, using cellulose and using trees as alternative materials for the development of very targeted applications is quite important. And so because of that, there's actually been a lot of interest from the Canadian government into funding research in these regards, because, as I mentioned, we can develop very green technologies using a very renewable and abundant resource. And so that's very important, and that really addresses a lot of issues that we're currently facing globally. So when coming to the University of British Columbia, I was quite attracted to specifically Mark McLaughlin, my research supervisor, who deals with making new materials derived from cellulose, from the main structural components of plants. In my research now, what I do is actually I take trees and I break them down into their very, very smallest components. and then rebuild them with very specific properties. A very interesting feature is that they will actually assemble into kind of a spiraling staircase structure. And that structure affords quite interesting materials properties. And in doing so, I've made materials that can be used for energy storage, materials used in kind of packaging and material development, as well as different materials used in catalysis, which is kind of a fancy way of saying it helps reactions proceed more quickly. Specifically, my research, I can see a lot of impact in the battery industry, for example. So one of my more recent projects, we've actually developed materials that can store energy quite well. And so you can then kind of envision that working into new batteries for electric cars, or batteries to operate power tools, what have you, anything that really relies on energy storage. There's many different facets to research pertaining to cellulose. So for example, if you go over to the Department of Forestry or Mechanical Engineering, they're developing new structural materials that can be used for building applications. Specifically in my lab in the chemistry department, we're kind of developing new materials for functional applications. So for example, one of my more recent projects, I've actually worked on kind of developing a battery-like material so it can store energy and release energy. Developing these new green technologies is very important as we kind of move towards sustainable materials for future application and use.